Look, I know how this is going to sound. I've been telling this story for months now, and I can see it in people's eyes, that little flicker of doubt, like maybe I'm making it all up for attention or something. But I'm not. I wish I were. My name's Cordelia, and last summer I thought I'd hit the jackpot with jobs. $22 an hour to sit by a pool all night at some fancy resort up in the mountains. The Clearwater Lodge, one of those places where rich people go to disconnect while still having five-star service. The night lifeguard position was perfect for me. I'm a strong swimmer. I needed the money for textbooks, and honestly, I'm kind of a night owl anyway. The job was exactly what you'd expect. I'd show up at 11 p.m., get briefed by the day shift manager, and then I'd have the entire pool area to myself until 6 in the morning. Just me, a whistle, some basic first aid supplies, and this gorgeous infinity pool that seemed to blend right into the darkness of the valley below. The first couple weeks were actually pretty relaxing. I'd bring my laptop, catch up on some online coursework, maybe read a book. The pool was heated, so steam would rise off the surface on cooler nights, creating these weird, dreamy patterns under the tiki torches they kept lit around the perimeter. The only sounds were the gentle hum of the filtration system and the occasional owl hooting from the pine trees. But during my third week, things started getting weird. It began with just a feeling, like when you're walking alone at night and you get that prickly sensation on the back of your neck, like someone's watching you. Except I was completely alone. The resort guests were all asleep in their cabins, and the nearest staff member was a night desk clerk, who was a good quarter-mile away in the main lodge. The first time I actually saw something was on a Thursday night. I was grading some papers for the tutoring job I'd lined up for fall semester when I caught movement in my peripheral vision, just a dark shape gliding beneath the surface of the pool, maybe 6 feet down. My head snapped up, but there was nothing there, just the underwater lights casting their blue glow and the gentle ripples from the filtration jets. I figured it was probably just a leaf or something that the skimmer hadn't caught. But leaves don't move like that, smooth and deliberate, like someone swimming underwater, but without any surface disturbance. Over the next few nights, I started seeing it more often, always in my peripheral vision, always gone when I looked directly. Sometimes it seemed small, like a fish or something, but other times it looked bigger, human-sized, which was impossible, obviously, because I would have heard a splash if someone had gotten in the pool. I started keeping a closer eye on the security cameras. The resort had them positioned at every entrance to the pool area, and I could access the feeds from the little monitor in the equipment shed. But whenever I checked, there was nothing unusual. Just me, sitting in my lifeguard chair, occasionally looking around like I was tracking something invisible. The footprints started appearing during my fourth week. I'd arrive at 11 to find wet footprints leading from the deep end of the pool to the equipment shed. Not just a few drops, full footprints, like someone had gotten out of the pool and walked across the concrete. The weird thing was, they were always completely dry by the time I'd do my first hourly check at midnight. I asked the day's shift if anyone had been swimming late, maybe a guest who'd gotten special permission or something. But according to the records, the pool had been empty since 6 p.m. every single day. The day lifeguard, this guy named Marcus, even started taking photos of the pool area when he left, just to prove it was completely dry. Still, every night, there were the footprints. I started bringing a towel with me to work, thinking maybe I could catch whoever was doing this. I'd pretend to be busy with paperwork, but keep watching the pool from the corner of my eye. That's when I saw it clearly for the first time. It was around 2:30 in the morning, and I was fighting to stay awake when I saw the surface of the water break. Not a splash. Exactly. More like something rising from the bottom, pushing the water aside gently. A head and shoulders emerged, silhouetted against the underwater lights. The figure was completely still for maybe 10 seconds, just floating there, and then it sank back down without a sound. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I grabbed my flashlight and ran to the edge of the pool, shining the beam down into the water. Nothing. The bottom was clearly visible, just the usual pool equipment and the drain covers. But the water was still moving in slow, concentric circles, like something large had just disturbed it. I called out, "Hello?" Is someone there? My voice echoed off the surrounding buildings, but there was no answer. The next morning, I told Marcus about it. He looked at me like I was losing my mind, but he agreed to stay late and keep me company for one night. We sat together from 11 to about 1 a.m., talking about normal stuff, his girlfriend, my classes, whether the resort's continental breakfast was worth getting up early for. Nothing happened. Marcus left around 1:15, giving me this patronizing smile and suggesting I might want to cut back on the energy drinks. But I swear, less than an hour after he left, I heard it, the sound of water being disturbed, like someone doing a gentle backstroke. When I looked, there were fresh ripples spreading across the surface. The thing that really freaked me out happened on my last night. I'd been thinking about quitting for a week. The job was good money, but I wasn't sleeping well during the day, and I kept having these dreams about being underwater, looking up at the surface but not being able to reach it. I must have dozed off in my chair around 4 a.m. When I woke up, the sun was just starting to rise, casting long shadows across the pool deck. But something was wrong. Really wrong. The pool was empty. Not just empty, completely drained. Bone dry. The bottom was visible, with just a few puddles in the deepest spots where the drains were. I stood up so fast I knocked over my chair, my mind racing. The pumps couldn't have malfunctioned that severely. It would have taken hours to drain that much water, and I would have heard it. I ran to the equipment shed to check the controls, but everything looked normal. All the switches were in their usual positions, no warning lights, no error codes on the digital displays. I grabbed my phone to call maintenance, but then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My clipboard was sitting on the ground next to the deep end. It was soaking wet, like it had been completely submerged. And there, written in water droplets across the concrete, were 2 words: "Join me." The letters were already starting to evaporate in the morning sun, but they were unmistakably there. The handwriting looked like it had been traced with a finger, each letter deliberate and clear. I backed away from the pool, my hand shaking so badly I could barely dial the maintenance number. By the time the first worker arrived 20 minutes later, the water was back. The pool was completely full, like nothing had ever happened. Pumps must have cycled overnight, the guy said, checking his diagnostic equipment. Sometimes the automatic systems do a full drain and refill for chemical balancing. Didn't anyone tell you about that? But I knew that wasn't what happened. And when I went to get my clipboard, it was completely dry. I turned in my resignation that morning. The manager tried to convince me to stay, even offered me a raise, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't spend another night sitting next to that pool, wondering what was watching me from beneath the surface. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm in the shower or at the campus pool for my morning swim. I'll be floating on my back, looking up at the ceiling, and I'll get this overwhelming feeling that something is looking back at me from below, something that's been waiting patiently for me to join it in the deep, dark water. I don't swim alone anymore. Story 2. I'm going to be straight with you. I never believed in ghosts before last summer. I was one of those guys who rolled his eyes at paranormal shows and made fun of people who claimed their houses were haunted. But working overnight security at St. Catherine's Children's Hospital changed all that. Some things you can't explain away, no matter how hard you try. My name's Lysander, and yeah, I know it's a weird name. My parents were really into Shakespeare. Anyway, I needed a summer job that would work around my pre-med classes, and hospital security seemed perfect. Good pay, decent benefits, and most importantly, it was overnight shifts, 11 p.m. to 8 a.m., which meant I could still attend my morning lectures. St. Catherine's is this massive complex on the outskirts of town, all red brick and tall windows that look imposing during the day and downright creepy at night. The pediatric ward where I was stationed takes up the entire 3rd floor of the main building. During the day, it's full of life. Doctors making rounds, nurses chatting, kids playing in the common areas. But at night, it's like a completely different world. My supervisor, Dave, was this gruff guy in his 50s who'd been doing security for 20 years. During my training, he walked me through the ward, showing me the patrol route, emergency procedures, all the standard stuff. The hallways were long and sterile, lined with patient rooms on both sides. Most of the kids were asleep by the time my shift started, So my job was basically to walk the halls every hour, check that all the doors were secure, and make sure no one was wandering around who shouldn't be there. Just remember, Dave told me on my first night, the East Wing is off limits, been closed for renovations since March. Don't waste time over there. Nothing to check, and maintenance gets pissy if they find footprints in their dust. The East Wing was sealed off with plastic sheeting and yellow caution tape. Through the clear plastic, I could see gutted rooms, exposed wiring hanging from the ceiling, and construction equipment covered in tarps. It looked like they were doing a complete overhaul. New electrical, plumbing, the works. My first week went smoothly. I'd make my rounds, occasionally peeking on the kids who couldn't sleep, chat with the night nurses during their break. The hospital had this weird kind of peace to it at night. Sure, there were always some machines beeping and occasional cry from a room, but overall it was quiet, calm. That changed during my second week. I was doing my 3 a.m. patrol when I heard it for the first time. Children laughing. Not the happy, carefree laughter you'd expect from kids playing during the day. This was different. Softer, more distant, like it was coming from far away, muffled by walls and distance. At first, I figured it was just some kids who couldn't sleep, maybe watching cartoons on their tablets or something. But as I walked down the main hallway, the laughter seemed to be coming from behind me. When I turned around, it stopped completely. I checked every room on my route that night. All the kids were asleep. The nurses hadn't heard anything unusual. According to them, it had been one of the quietest nights they'd had in weeks. But I knew what I'd heard. The next night, it happened again. Same time, right around 3 a.m. But this time, I was able to track the direction better. The laughter was definitely coming from the East Wing. The sealed-off, supposedly empty East Wing that was nothing but construction debris and plastic sheeting. I stood at the entrance, staring through the clear plastic barrier. The hallway beyond was dark, except for the faint glow of emergency lighting. Dust particles floated in the air like tiny ghosts, and everything was covered in a fine layer of construction dust that would show footprints clearly. The laughter came again, echoing from somewhere deep in the abandoned wing. It sounded like at least 3 or 4 children, maybe more. Whispered conversations mixed with soft giggles, like kids telling secrets at a sleepover. I radioed the main desk. "Hey, Tom, you got anyone scheduled to work in the East Wing tonight?" "Negative," came the crackling reply. "Construction crew doesn't start until 7 a.m., and they're not working weekends anyway." "Why?" "Just checking something. I'll get back to you." I grabbed my flashlight and ducked under the caution tape. The plastic sheeting crinkled as I pushed through it, and immediately I was hit with the smell of sawdust, drywall compound, and something else. Something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in water. The hallway stretched ahead of me, patient rooms branching off on both sides. Most of the doors had been removed, leaving dark rectangular openings that my flashlight beam couldn't fully penetrate. The laughter continued, always seeming to come from just ahead of me, around the next corner. I followed the sound deeper into wing, my footsteps echoing off the bare concrete floor. The construction crew had stripped everything down to the studs. Exposed pipes ran along the ceiling, and loose wires hung down like jungle vines. It should have felt industrial, sterile. Instead, it felt inhabited. The voices got clearer as I went deeper. I could make out actual words now, though they were too soft to understand completely. Children's voices, definitely. Young kids, maybe 5 or 6 years old, having some kind of conversation. Occasionally one would laugh, and the others would shush them playfully. I rounded a corner, and my flashlight beam swept across something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Crayon drawings covered the plastic sheeting that hung over the walls. Dozens of them. Stick figures holding hands in circles. Smiling faces with big round eyes. Houses with crooked chimneys and smoke curling up toward the ceiling. They looked like the kind of drawings you'd find taped to any refrigerator in suburbia. Except these were drawn on construction plastic in an abandoned hospital wing at 3 a.m. I approached slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The drawings were fresh. I could smell the waxy scent of crayons, and when I touched one carefully with my finger, it smudged slightly. Some of the pictures showed children playing together, running, jumping rope. but others were different. In the center of the plastic wall was a larger drawing that made my blood run cold. It showed a circle of stick-figure children, all holding hands around a tall, dark figure. The figure was much larger than the others, and it had no face, just a blank oval where features should be. The children in the drawing were all smiling, their arms reaching up toward the faceless figure, like they were trying to touch it. The laughter stopped. I spun around, sweeping my flashlight beam across the hallway behind me. Nothing, just dust motes dancing in the light, and the sound of my own ragged breathing. "Hello?" I called out. "Is anyone there?" My voice echoed back from the empty rooms, but there was no other response. I waited for maybe 30 seconds, listening hard, but the wing had gone completely silent. That's when I noticed the footprints. Small ones, child-sized, leading away from where I was standing and disappearing around another corner. They were fresh, pressed into construction dust that covered the floor. And they were bare feet. I could see the impression of tiny toes. I followed them, my flashlight beam shaking as my hands trembled. The footprints led to a dead-end hallway that had been completely gutted. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide, but the prints just stopped right in the middle of the hallway, like whoever had made them had simply vanished. I stood there for what felt like hours, sweeping my light across every surface, looking for any sign of where the children could have gone. But there was nothing, just me, alone in an empty construction zone, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and that strange, sweet floral scent. When I finally made it back to the main desk, Tom looked up from his crossword puzzle with a grin. "Find what you were looking for in the East Wing?" "What do you mean?" "I've been watching you on the cameras for the last 20 minutes. You were standing in that dead-end hallway, having a whole conversation with someone. Looked pretty animated, too." He chuckled. "Didn't know you were the type to talk to yourself, Lysander." I stared at him. "You saw me talking to someone?" "Well, I saw you talking. Couldn't see who you were talking to. Probably just a camera angle. But you were definitely chatting with somebody." I went back to the monitor room and asked Tom to pull up the footage. There I was on the grainy black and white screen, standing in that hallway. And Tom was right. I was clearly talking to someone, gesturing with my hands, even nodding like I was listening to responses. But I was completely alone in the frame. I don't remember talking to anyone. I remember following the footprints and standing there in confusion, but I definitely wasn't having a conversation. Yet the footage was clear. I spent nearly 20 minutes interacting with someone the cameras couldn't see. The next morning, I went back to the East Wing with the day shift supervisor. I wanted to show someone the crayon drawings, get some kind of confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind. They were gone. The plastic sheeting was clean, unmarked. No trace of crayon, no waxy smell, nothing. When I insisted they'd been there just hours before, the supervisor gave me this look like maybe I needed to consider a different line of work. But I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. I finished out my summer contract, but I never went back to the East Wing. Some nights I'd still hear the laughter, always around 3 a.m., always coming from that sealed-off section of the hospital. The other guards said they'd heard it too, over the years. Kids playing where no kids should be. The weird thing is, I did some research before I quit. Turns out the East Wing used to be the terminal ward, back in the 60s and 70s. That's where they put the kids who weren't going to make it home. The hospital renovated it into regular patient rooms in the 80s, but they're gutting it again now, turning it into administrative offices. I guess some things don't want to leave, even when it's time to go. I'm studying to be a doctor now, and I'll probably work in hospitals for the rest of my career. But I'll never work pediatric night shifts again. Some conversations are meant to stay between the living and the living. The children in that East Wing, they're still talking to someone. I just hope it's each other. Story 3. I used to love the mountains. Used to. Before last summer, I'd spend every free weekend on some trail, backpack loaded with gear, breathing in that crisp alpine air that makes you feel like you're on top of the world. Now I can't even look at hiking photos on Instagram without getting the sick feeling in my stomach. My name's Persephone. Yeah, like the Greek goddess. My parents were classics professors. What can I say? Anyway, I've been guiding hiking trips since I was 17, and last summer I finally landed my dream job with Cascade Adventures. They specialize in multi-day wilderness experiences for families who want to disconnect from technology and reconnect with nature. Basically, city people paying good money to sleep in tents and complain about bugs. The job was perfect for me. I knew those mountains like the back of my hand. I was wilderness first aid certified, and I genuinely loved showing people how beautiful and peaceful the backcountry could be. Most trips went exactly as planned. A little grumbling about sore feet, some amazement at the views, mores around the campfire. Everyone goes home with great photos and stories to tell their co-workers. But the trip I'm about to tell you about, that one changed everything. It was mid-July when I got assigned to guide the Morrison family, Dad, Tom, Mom, Linda, and their twin daughters Emma and Sophie, both around 12. They were from Seattle, nice enough people, though it was obvious this was their first real wilderness experience. Tom kept checking his phone, even though I told him there was no cell service where we were going, and Linda had packed enough bug spray for a small army. The plan was simple: 3 days, 2 nights, ending at Crystal Lake. It's this gorgeous alpine lake about 15 miles into the Cascade Wilderness, surrounded by snow-capped peaks and pristine forest. I'd done the route probably 20 times before. It should have been routine. The first day went perfectly. We hiked about 6 miles through old-growth forest, set up camp near a creek, cooked dinner over our camp stove. The girls were actually pretty good hikers once they got into the rhythm, and Tom and Linda seemed to be relaxing, finally putting their phones away and actually looking around at the scenery. Day 2 was when we reached Crystal Lake, and I have to admit, even after all my years in those mountains, the view still took my breath away. The lake sits in this natural bowl carved out by glaciers thousands of years ago. The water's so clear, and still it perfectly mirrors the surrounding peaks. It's the kind of place that makes you understand why people talk about spiritual experiences in nature. We set up camp on the North Shore, in a flat area I'd used many times before. There's this perfect little clearing surrounded by pine trees, with a natural windbreak and easy access to the water for cooking and cleaning. The girls were excited to try fishing, and Tom was already talking about how he couldn't wait to tell his buddies at work about the place. Everything was perfect until the sun went down. We finished dinner and were sitting around our camp stove. No campfires allowed in the wilderness area. When we first heard it, music, soft, haunting music drifting across the water from somewhere on the opposite shore. At first, I thought maybe there was another camping group over there, though that would have been unusual. Crystal Lake isn't exactly a secret, but it's remote enough that you rarely encounter other hikers, especially midweek. But as we sat there listening, I realized this wasn't someone playing a guitar or humming around their campfire. It was something else entirely. A melody I'd never heard before, but somehow familiar, like a lullaby your grandmother might have sung, if your grandmother was from some other century. The sound seemed to float across the water, carried on the still night air with an almost supernatural clarity. "That's beautiful," Linda whispered. "Someone over there must be a really talented musician." I grabbed my binoculars and scanned the opposite shore. The moon was full, casting everything in silver light, so visibility was actually pretty good. That's when I saw her, a figure in white, standing at the very edge of the water, completely motionless, like a statue. She was maybe half a mile away. But even at that distance, I could make out the flowing white dress or robe she was wearing. Her long hair seemed to move slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel on our side of the lake. "Can you see who it is?" Tom asked, moving closer to me. I handed him the binoculars. "There's someone over there. A woman, I think." He looked for a long moment, then handed the binoculars back. "I don't see anyone." I looked again. The figure was still there, clear as day, but when I passed the binoculars to Linda, she couldn't see her either. Neither could the girls. According to them, the opposite shore was completely empty, but I could see her, and I could hear that haunting melody, growing stronger and more beautiful with each passing minute. "Maybe we should go check it out," Tom said, and that's when I noticed a boat. There was a small wooden rowboat tied to a tree near our campsite. I'd been to Crystal Lake dozens of times, and there had never been a boat there before. It looked old but well-maintained, like something out of a fairy tale, with carved details on the bow and oarlocks that gleamed like they'd been recently polished. Where did that come from? I asked, more to myself than anyone else. It was there when we arrived, Emma said. I saw it when we were setting up the tents. But I knew that wasn't true. I would have noticed a boat. I always do a complete survey of any campsite before we set up, checking for hazards, previous campers' trash, anything that might affect our stay. There had been no boat. Tom was already walking toward it, drawn by the same curiosity that was tugging at me. The music seemed to be getting louder, more insistent, and the figure in white remained perfectly still on the distant shore. I'm going to row over and see who that is, he announced. Maybe they need help, or maybe they know something about the area we should know. Looking back, I should have stopped him. I was a guide, the one responsible for everyone's safety. But something about that music, that figure, the mysterious appearance of the boat, it all felt like it was meant to happen, like we were supposed to investigate. Tom pushed the boat into the water and climbed in. The oars moved smoothly and silently, barely disturbing the mirror-perfect surface of the lake. We watched from shore as he rowed steadily toward the opposite side, his figure growing smaller and smaller in the moonlight. The music continued, beautiful and hypnotic. Linda sat down on a fallen log, and the girls curled up beside her, all of us mesmerized by the ethereal melody floating across the water. It felt like we were part of some ancient story, witnessing something magical and rare. Tom was about halfway across when something changed. The figure in white, which had been standing motionless for so long, began to move. She walked forward, deeper into the water, and I realized with growing alarm that she wasn't stopping. "Tom!" I shouted across the lake. "Tom, come back!" But he kept rowing, apparently unable to hear me, or maybe unwilling to listen. The figure continued walking into the lake until the water reached her waist, then her chest. Tom's boat was close now, maybe 50 yards away from where she stood. That's when she disappeared beneath the surface. Not dove, not fell, just sank straight down like she was made of stone. The music stopped instantly, leaving only the sound of Tom's oars cutting to the water and our own panicked breathing. We watched as Tom reached the spot where the figure had been. He stopped rowing and leaned over the side of the boat, peering down into the dark water. He sat there for maybe 30 seconds, completely still, and then he leaned further over the edge. Too far. The boat tipped, and Tom fell into the lake with a splash that echoed across the water like a gunshot. We waited for him to surface, to grab onto the boat, to call out for help. The boat righted itself and began drifting slowly back toward our shore. But Tom never came up. "Dad!" the girls screamed, and Linda was already kicking off her shoes, ready to jump into the lake herself. I grabbed her arm. "No, you can't swim in that water at night. You'll just get hypothermia and we'll lose you too." We spent the rest of the night searching the shoreline with our flashlights, calling his name until our voices were hoarse. When dawn broke, I hiked to the highest point I could reach and used my emergency satellite beacon to call for help. The search and rescue team arrived by helicopter 6 hours later. They brought divers, sonar equipment, everything. They searched that lake for 3 days, mapping every inch of the bottom, checking underwater caves and crevices. They never found Tom's body. The weird part, the part that still keeps me awake at night, is what the rescue coordinator told me on the last day of the search. He'd been working search and rescue in those mountains for 15 years, and he'd never seen a boat at Crystal Lake before. According to him, there were no roads close enough to transport a boat that size, and the trail was too rough for anyone to carry one in. Must have been left by some old mining operation, he said, but he didn't sound convinced. When I asked about the boat Tom had used, the one that drifted back to shore that night, the coordinator just stared at me. "What boat?" he asked. "We didn't find any boat." I know there was a boat. Linda and the girls saw it too, before everything happened. But when the rescue team searched our campsite, there was nothing. No boat, no oars, no evidence that one had ever been there. I quit guiding after that summer. Couldn't handle being responsible for other people's safety when I didn't understand what happened to Tom, or why I was the only one who could see the figure in white. Sometimes I wonder if Tom saw her too, in those final moments before he went under. If he heard her calling to him from beneath the dark water of Crystal Lake, if maybe in some way he chose to follow her down into whatever world exists below the surface of those deep mountain lakes. I still dream about that music sometimes. That beautiful, haunting melody that seemed to promise something wonderful just out of reach. And in my dreams, I'm always tempted to follow it, to walk into the water and let it carry me away to wherever Tom went. But I wake up before I take that final step. Some invitations are too dangerous to accept, no matter how beautiful they sound. Story 4. I know what you're thinking when you hear my name. Octavius sounds like some Roman emperor or something. My parents were English professors, and they thought they were being creative. Trust me, I've heard all the jokes. But after what happened last summer at my great aunt's farm in Kansas, I kind of wish I had a boring name like John or Mike. Sometimes standing out isn't worth it. My great aunt Millicent owned this little produce stand about 40 miles outside Topeka, right where the highway cuts through endless fields of corn and wheat. It wasn't much to look at, just a weathered wooden shack with hand-painted signs advertising fresh tomatoes, sweet corn, and whatever else was in season. She'd been running it for 30 years, ever since my great-uncle died and left the farm. I needed a summer job, and Aunt Millie needed help. She was getting up there in age, somewhere in her 70s, though she never told anyone her exact age, and the long days were getting harder for her. The deal was simple. I'd work the evening shift from 4 p.m. to midnight. She'd handle mornings and afternoons, and we'd split the profits 50-50. It seemed like easy money. How hard could it be to sell vegetables to passing motorists? The first thing I noticed was how quiet it got after dark. During the day, there was a steady stream of cars on the highway, people stopping for fresh produce on their way to or from the city. But once the sun went down, traffic practically disappeared. I'd sit there reading textbooks by the light of a single bare bulb, sometimes going hours without seeing a single car. That's when Aunt Millie told me about the midnight customers. "Don't be alarmed if people show up after I'm gone," she said on my third day, like it was the most natural thing in the world. They've been coming for years. Quiet folks, very polite. They always leave exact change on the counter and only take what they need. I laughed. "You mean you let people shop on the honor system after hours?" She gave me this look. Serious, almost warning. "They're not like regular customers. Octavius. They come from the old farmhouse, back through the corn. Been doing it since before you were born." What old farmhouse? But she just shook her head and went back to arranging the tomatoes. "You'll see. Just remember, be respectful. Don't follow them, and never, ever go looking for that farmhouse during the day. Some things are better left alone." I figured she was just being eccentric. Small town Kansas. Old lady living alone for decades. It made sense that she developed some quirky beliefs about her customers. Maybe she was talking about some reclusive neighbors who were too shy to shop during normal hours. The first time they showed up, I almost called the police. It was around 2 a.m. on a moonless night in late June. I was half asleep in my chair when I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Not the sound of a car pulling up, just footsteps. Soft, deliberate, like people try not to make noise. I looked up to see 3 figures emerging from the cornfield across the road. Even in the dim light from the stand's single bulb, something about them seemed off. They moved too smoothly, too quietly, and their clothes looked wrong somehow. Old-fashioned, like they'd stepped out of a photograph from the 1940s. The first figure was a woman in a long dress with her hair pinned up in an outdated style. Behind her came a man in overalls and a work shirt and a small child, maybe 8 or 9 years old, holding the woman's hand. They approached the stand with measured steps, never making eye contact with me. I started to say hello, but the words died in my throat. Up close, I could see their faces more clearly, and they were pale. Not just pale, colorless, like old newspaper left in the sun. Their eyes were dark hollows, and when they moved, it was with this strange, floating quality that made my skin crawl. They moved through the produce stand methodically, selecting vegetables with careful precision. The woman picked out several ears of corn. The man chose tomatoes and green beans, and the child gathered small potatoes from a basket near the counter. They worked in complete silence, never speaking to each other or acknowledging my presence. When they were finished, the woman placed a small stack of bills on the counter. Old bills. I could see that even in the dim light, but they looked crisp and new despite their vintage appearance. Then, without a word, all three of them turned and walked back toward the cornfield. I watched them disappear between the tall stalks, their figures swallowed by the darkness. The whole encounter had lasted maybe 10 minutes, but felt like hours. My hands were shaking as I counted the money they'd left, exact change, down to the penny, for everything they'd taken. The bills were from the 1940s, but they looked like they'd been printed yesterday. I told Aunt Millie about it the next morning, expecting her to be surprised or concerned. Instead, she just nodded like I'd reported the weather. "The Henderson family," she said matter-of-factly. "They come every few weeks. Always pay fair, never cause trouble." "Henderson family? Are they your neighbors?" She was quiet for a long moment, organizing receipts that didn't need organizing. They used to be, long time ago. That should have been my cue to ask more questions, to demand explanations. But something in her tone made it clear the conversation was over. And honestly, part of me didn't want to know more. Some questions are better left unasked. The midnight customers became a regular part of my routine. Not every night, but often enough that I started expecting them. Always during the new moon, always the same three figures, always purchasing the same types of vegetables. They'd emerge from a corn, shop in silence, leave exact change, and disappear back into the field. I got used to it, in the way you get used to anything that happens often enough. It was weird, sure, but they weren't hurting anyone. If anything, they were my most reliable customers. But curiosity is a dangerous thing, especially when you're 19 and think you're smarter than everyone else. One night in late July, after the Henderson family had made their usual silent purchase and headed back into the corn, I decided to follow them. Aunt Millie had warned me not to, but I convinced myself I was just being responsible. What if they were trespassing on someone's property? What if there was some logical explanation for their strange behavior that everyone was just too superstitious to investigate? I grabbed a flashlight and headed into the cornfield, following the narrow path the figures had taken. The corn was tall that time of year, over my head, creating a natural tunnel through the field. The air was thick and still, filled with the rustling sound of leaves brushing against each other. I'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when I saw the light ahead. Not electric light, something warmer, more yellow like oil lamps or candles. As I got closer, the corn began to thin out, and I found myself at the edge of a clearing I'd never seen before. In the center of the clearing stood a farmhouse. It was identical to Aunt Millie's place. Same weathered siding, same wraparound porch, same architectural details. But this house looked older, more worn, like it had been abandoned for decades. Paint peeled from the siding, and the windows were dark except for that warm, flickering light coming from what looked like the kitchen. Through the kitchen window, I could see the Henderson family. They were sitting around a wooden table, eating the vegetables they'd purchased from our stand. The woman was cutting corn off the cob, the man was slicing tomatoes, and the child was carefully arranging green beans on a plate. They looked so normal, so domestic, like any family having a late dinner. That's when they all looked up at once and stared directly at me. Their faces, God, their faces. What I'd thought were shadows around their eyes weren't shadows at all. They had no eyes, just smooth, blank skin where their features should have been. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just pale, featureless ovals that somehow still conveyed the sense that they were looking right at me. I ran. I don't remember making the conscious decision to run, but suddenly I was crashing through the corn, branches scratching at my face and arms, my flashlight beam dancing wildly as I stumbled toward the road. Behind me, I could hear nothing, no sound of pursuit, no voices calling out, just the rustling of corn and my own panicked breathing. When I finally burst out of the field and reached the produce stand, I was bleeding from dozens of small cuts and my shirt was torn. I sat in my chair, shaking, until dawn came and Aunt Millie arrived for her morning shift. She took one look at me and sighed. "You went looking for the farmhouse, didn't you?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "I told you not to. Some things." She shook her head sadly. What did you see? I described the house, the family, their blank faces. As I talked, Aunt Millie's expression grew more and more troubled. That farmhouse burned down in 1943, she said quietly. Lightning strike during a summer storm. The Henderson family, all three of them, died in the fire. Bodies were never recovered. She pulled out an old photograph from her purse, yellowed with age. It showed a family of three standing in front of a farmhouse identical to the one I'd seen. The woman, the man, the child, all exactly as they'd appeared to me. Except in the photograph, they had faces. Normal, human faces with eyes and smiles and all the features that make us recognizably alive. My grandmother used to tell stories about them. Aunt Millie continued. Said they never really left. They just continued on the way they always had, growing their garden, preparing their meals, living their lives. Death didn't seem to change their routine much. I stare at the photograph, my hands still trembling. But why do they come to the stand? Why buy vegetables when they're dead? Aunt Millie finished. I don't know, honey. Maybe they don't know they're dead. Maybe they're just trying to keep living the only way they remember how. The Henderson family came twice more before summer ended. Both times, I stayed in my chair and let them shop in peace. They left their money, took their vegetables, and disappeared back into the corn. I never followed them again. Aunt Millie died the next week. Heart attack in her sleep. She was 79. It turned out the family decided to sell the farm, and I went back to college early. I heard from my cousin that the new owners tore down the produce stand and planted the whole area in soybeans. No more midnight customers, no more honor system shopping, just modern agriculture and practical business decisions. Sometimes I wonder what happened to the Henderson family when their favorite vegetable stand disappeared. Did they find somewhere else to shop? Are they still wandering through cornfields somewhere in Kansas, looking for fresh produce and a place to continue their interrupted lives? Or maybe, when the produce stand was torn down, they finally realized it was time to let go, time to stop trying to maintain the routines of the living and accept whatever comes next. I hope that's what happened. I hope they found peace. But on nights when the moon is dark and I'm driving through rural areas, I sometimes catch myself looking into cornfields, wondering if I'll see three figures in old-fashioned clothes walking between the rows, still searching for the simple, normal life that was taken from them so many years ago. Some routines are harder to break than others, even death. Story 5. I used to think house sitting was a perfect college job. Free accommodation, minimal responsibilities, and usually just enough money to cover gas and groceries. Last summer, I thought I'd hit the jackpot when the Carmichaels offered me 2 months at their beach house on the Oregon coast. A gorgeous oceanfront property, private beach access, and all I had to do was water some plants and make sure nobody broke in. My name's Serafina, and yeah, I know it sounds pretentious. My mom went through a celestial names phase when I was born. Anyway, I was a junior at Portland State, studying marine biology, so spending a summer by the ocean seemed like paradise. The Carmichaels were family friends who bought the place as a retirement investment, though they rarely used it themselves. The house was incredible, all weathered cedar and massive windows facing Pacific, perched on a bluff about 30 feet above the beach. During the day, you could watch whales migrating south, and at night, the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below was like nature's own white noise machine. It should have been the most relaxing summer of my life. But the Oregon coast has its own personality, especially in the off-season. Thick fog rolls in without warning, turning bright afternoons into something out of a Stephen King novel. The wind never stops, and when storm systems move through, the waves can reach heights that make you understand why so many ships have been wrecked along this coastline. The Carmichaels mentioned the tides when they handed over the keys. High tide gets pretty dramatic, Mr. Carmichael warned. Sometimes the waves come right up to the base of the bluff. Nothing to worry about. The house has been here for 40 years, but it can be loud at night. He was right about the noise. On stormy nights, the sound of water hitting rock was like thunder, shaking the windows and making it hard to sleep. But I got used to it. What I didn't get used to were the voices. It started my second week there. I'd fallen asleep on the couch while reading one of those paperback mysteries you buy at airport bookstores. The sound of shouting woke me up around 2:47 a.m. I remember checking my phone because the time seemed weirdly specific. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks, the way it whistles through the rocks and creates sounds that almost seem like voices. But as I sat there listening, the shouting became clearer. People calling for help. Multiple voices, desperate and panicked, coming from somewhere out on the water. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, my bare feet slipping on the wet deck. The night was foggy, visibility maybe 20 feet, but I could hear them clearly now. Help us. Over here. Please, somebody. My heart was racing as I aimed the flashlight toward the ocean, sweeping the beam back and forth across the waves. The voices seemed to be coming from different directions, like there were several people in the water, scattered across a wide area. I fumbled for my phone and called 911. The dispatcher was professional but skeptical. Maritime rescues along this stretch of coast were common, but they needed more specific information, exact location, number of people, any visible distress signals. I can hear them calling for help, I insisted. They're out there right now. The Coast Guard launched a search boat within an hour. I stood on the deck, watching their spotlights sweep across the dark water, listening to their radio chatter. They searched for 3 hours and found nothing. No people, no debris, no sign that anyone had been in distress. The voices stopped the moment I stepped outside with a flashlight. Probably just the wind, the Coast Guard officer told me when he called back. This coastline can play tricks on your ears, especially at night. Sound carries weird here, bounces off the rocks in ways that can seem almost supernatural. I wanted to believe him. I convinced myself it had been my imagination, maybe a dream I was having while dozing on the couch. But the next night, at exactly 2:47 a.m., I heard them again. This time I was fully awake, making tea in the kitchen when the shouting started. Same desperate voices, same panic calls for help. I looked out the kitchen window toward the ocean, and that's when I saw something that made my blood freeze. Lights. Not the steady beam of a Coast Guard cutter or the running lights of a fishing boat. These were scattered, flickering lights that seemed to be moving erratically across the water, like flashlights or emergency flares, winking in and out of existence as they were obscured by waves. I called 911 again, but by the time I'd given them the information, the lights were gone. The voices continued for maybe 10 more minutes, then faded away as suddenly as they'd started. Another Coast Guard search. Another 3 hours of finding nothing. Ma'am, the officer said when he called back, we've done 2 searches now with negative results. Are you sure about what you're seeing and hearing? I wasn't sure about anything anymore, but I was curious, and curiosity can be dangerous when you deal with things you don't understand. The next day, I drove into the nearest town and spent the afternoon at the local library, researching the history of the area. What I found made my hands shake as I scrolled through old newspaper articles. July 15, 1987. A charter fishing boat called the Mariner's Dream had capsized during a sudden storm about 2 miles offshore from where I was staying. 12 passengers, all tourists from California. The boat went down at 2:47 a.m. during high tide. No survivors. No bodies ever recovered. The article described how other boats in the area had reported hearing distress calls for hours after Mariner's Dream disappeared, but search efforts were hampered by fog and rough seas. The Coast Guard had eventually called off the search, ruling it a total loss. I stared at the date. July 15th was tomorrow night. I should have left. I should have packed my stuff and driven back to Portland. Found some excuse to tell the Carmichaels about why I couldn't finish the house-sitting job. But part of me, the marine biology student who was fascinated by the ocean's mysteries, needed to know what would happen on the anniversary. I positioned myself in the living room with a clear view of the ocean, my phone ready to record whatever happened. At 2:47 a.m., right on schedule, the voices began. But this time was different. This time, I could see them. Figures in the water, maybe a dozen people scattered across the waves. They were pale, almost luminescent in the darkness, and they moved wrong. Not swimming, exactly, but floating, bobbing with the motion of the waves while somehow staying in the same general area. I grabbed my binoculars and focused on the closest figure. It was a man, middle-aged, wearing what looked like a life jacket. His mouth was moving. He was one of the voices calling for help, but his eyes were fixed on the shore, on the house, on me. They were all looking at me. Every single figure in the water had turned toward the house, their pale faces upturned, their voices carrying across the waves with impossible clarity. They weren't just calling for help anymore. They were calling my name. Serafina. They whispered, the sound somehow audible over the crash of waves and wind. Serafina, help us. I dropped the binoculars and backed away from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. But I couldn't stop looking. The figures were moving now, not away from shore like you'd expect from people caught in a riptide, but toward it, toward the house. I watched in horror as they began to emerge in the waves, water streaming from their clothes as they walked up the beach. They moved in single file, like a procession, their faces still turned upward toward my window. Their clothes were wrong, outdated, like they'd been underwater for decades. And their skin? God, their skin was the color of something that had been submerged too long, pale and slightly green, with dark patches that might have been barnacles or seaweed. They stood on the beach below the house for what felt like hours, just staring up at me. 12 figures in waterlogged clothes, their mouths moving in silent pleas for help that I couldn't give, help that had come 37 years too late. As the first light of dawn began to touch the horizon, they turned and walked backward into the ocean, not diving, not swimming, just walking straight back into the waves as if the water were solid ground. I watched until the last figure disappeared beneath the surface, leaving only the normal sound of waves against rock. I packed my car that morning and left a voicemail for the Carmichaels about a family emergency. I couldn't stay another night in that house, couldn't risk seeing those lost souls again. Some responsibilities are too heavy for the living to bear. I did some more research when I got back to Portland. The Mariner's Dream incident wasn't the only maritime disaster in that area. Ships had been running aground on those rocks for over a century, drawn off course by fog and unpredictable currents. The house sits right above what locals call the Widow's Point, a stretch of coastline where more vessels have been lost than anywhere else along the Oregon coast. I think about those 12 passengers sometimes, especially when I'm studying oceanography and learning about how currents work, how bodies behave in salt water, how the ocean keeps its secrets. They've been calling for help for 37 years, emerging from their watery grave every night at the exact time their boat went down. The Carmichaels never found another house sitter. They ended up selling the place to a developer who tore it down and built condominiums. I wonder if the new residents hear the voices too, if they see the pale figures walking up from the waves each night at 2:47 a.m., or maybe, without the house to focus on, without someone to witness their nightly plea for rescue, the passengers of the Mariner's Dream finally found peace beneath the dark Pacific waters. I hope so. Some stories shouldn't have to be retold every single night for eternity.